Last time in class, we were discussing patterns of conversation relative to gender, and I want to continue that discussion here. I want to turn to the work by Leeper and Ayers to answer the question, who's the chattiest, which is to say, who talks the most? Excuse me. There is this long-held stereotype that women talk much more than men. You have the image of the man hunched over his dinner, and the woman just talking, talking, talking. This is sort of this old tired stereotype. You then have Deborah Tannen, who I talked about with Genderlect. Deborah Tannen, who talks about research that suggests actually men talk much more than women do, and as part of the whole, men are engaging in report talk and not rapport talk, and so they're actually speaking. When you go and look at it, men are actually speaking more. This is part of their showing off and just talking to show off, which I'm now doing, very self-conscious now, right? So the question, who's the chattiest then, or who does the most talking? Well, women and men use about equal number of words, like as to say in a conversation. We don't really see much of a difference between women and men, and when you put them in a situation to have a conversation, or if we record them having a conversation, perhaps in a naturalized setting, we don't really see, by naturalized I mean in their home versus where you say come in and talk to this person for a few minutes. We see women and men using about the same number of words. The research does suggest that women perhaps talk more with children than to men, but uh, the research isn't total. We're not totally certain of that just based on the research that's been seen. I say we. Lieber and Ayers aren't totally certain of that just because so much of that has been in a lab setting, and people don't always act quite like themselves in lab settings, especially with children. But anyway, as I say, parents and children. So women and men do seem to use about equal number of words. But something else comes up. Men talk more at a time. So in a conversation, it's sort of like once it's the man's turn, if you will. We do talk about turns in conversation. Once it's the man's turn, he's likely to go longer than the woman, or than a woman. He's not necessarily talking to a woman, whether he's talking to a woman or talking to a man. He's more likely to talk more at a time than a woman is. And women have more conversational turns. So women do more of talking, and then, I mean, right? The person says something, they say, yeah, I know, that's also what I was thinking. I mean, right, right. And then the other person talks, and then goes back again. And so that's what you see, is that the total word set are about the same, but with men, it's more talking in a burst, and women, it's more of a back and forth, which is interesting. And because if we go back to Tannen's notion of Genderlect and report talk, it gives at least, if not full support for it, we can see this idea of, men perhaps are more likely to engage in a conversational pattern in which they're holding forth, we might say, whereas women are engaging back and forth with the other person. So we see some sense of that, but overall, men and women talk about the same, men holding forth longer at a time, women engaging in more exchanges with the other person. If we look at some other data from Leeper and Ayers about conversation, when they look at lots of studies about research on conversation and gender, overall, and there's some asterisks there, meaning, I mean, these aren't hard and fast statements, but they do find that overall, when you look across the research, men used more assertive language than women, but just barely. So it was there, but it wasn't really dramatic. But they did find it, just not dramatically so. And thus and by contrast, women use more affiliative language. And so we're talking about assertive versus affiliative language. You might think the assertive language as being associated with what Tannen would call report talk, and the affiliative language being more about rapport talk. As we're talking about affiliative language here, again, it's that women were more likely to use language that showed an active understanding, like, right, yes, okay, makes sense, right? And the verbal support, of course, naturally. So more likely to use that sort of affiliative language that was a little more clear. And also, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference, though, for whether or not women, or for women using more agreements or acknowledgments of men, going, mm-hmm, yes, not so much. So understanding, letting a person know, I'm getting what you're saying, and of course, right, but necessarily agreeing or acknowledging, if my examples may not be really sharp with that, but you need to know that understanding and verbal support versus just agreeing and acknowledging. Like agreeing is saying, yes, I think you're right, and acknowledging is, mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, that there doesn't seem to be as clear that women do that more than men, though. So there is something to be said for women do perhaps use, or women using more affiliative speech than men. But in the research on all this, context of where the research is taking place is really key, and that actually may tell us something else. So college women showed more of this pattern of, using affiliative speech and less assertive speech. Right? So women using more affiliative speech and less assertive speech was seen when the sample was among college women. So if we think about that, it may in part be because in colleges you're more likely to have lab settings, which we would not refer to as a natural setting, but if you're, say, for like a psychology class, right, you go and you meet up some person you've never met before in a room, and you're told to have a conversation about the weather, or what do you think of the university, or I don't know what, and they look at the words that are said. One of the things they find is that in those sorts of situations, that's what college women are more likely to be participants. And yeah, college women use more affiliative speech and less assertive speech. This also says something to us probably about age, right? Thinking that college women in general are between the ages of like 18 and 24. And also there may be some class factors here. It may be, and not strictly speaking, I don't want to make a statement, especially at a place like ETSU, which has a good number of first-generation college students. I'm going to come back to that in just one second here. First-generation college students, but still, where there is a certain class expectation then perhaps at the university, right? Or having the sorts of, being in the sort of situations, how one is expected to behave. I said I was going to come back and talk about first-generation students. I don't know if you, maybe not technically, I don't know. I am the first generation in my family, depending on where you want to make the count, to have gone to college. My dad had an uncle who went to college, so on his side, I guess Uncle Bill, who I never met, would be the person. My grandfather did not go to college. My dad went to like a year of junior college, so maybe that counts. I don't know. And my mom went to a little bit of junior college, and that was it. And nobody before her had ever gotten a college degree. They'd been school teachers, but that was a different process in the late 19th century. So, yeah, but I understand, though, then, from looking, say, at my parents, who never really went to college, but who raised children who all went to college, and all, though it would take some of them 20 plus years, Kathy, Lori, sorry, stuck in my throat there, to complete college degrees, right, which they really wanted us to do. That was something very important to them. That there is a certain class expectation about how one is to engage people. So, something to be said there that even if you don't come from a certain tradition or class background, that perhaps there is an expectation about how one will speak. That could be part of it. But again, it's all to say that that pattern of the greater affiliation, less assertive speech among women wasn't something that was seen as much, or was not really seen, excuse me, for women who were not students. So, do women use more affiliative speech? Well, it would seem that certain women do. So there may be some other factors involved there. Right. They found that there were a couple studies that found that women were more affiliative in their talk and men were more assertive. And that pattern, when it did emerge, it was when they were talking with strangers. So something about that. When you're just talking to somebody you just met, men were more likely to have this sort of assertiveness and talkativeness and report talk sort of thing, and women more of a rapport talk sort of thing happening when it was a stranger. But if you went into the situation with, say, a friend, or if they were recording people talking with their, relational partner, like their partner, we'll say, yeah, you didn't really see that pattern. So Again, context, context, context. We really don't have any broad rules. It would seem there's just some patterns that do emerge, but they seem to be related to perhaps some other things and not merely about whether we are male or female. When we're talking about talking and this notion of report talk, we've got to talk about bragging. And so we're talking about bragging. This is not just making positive disclosures. As I say, that bragging is more than positive disclosures. So it's not merely that I tell you that my daughter is doing well in her second grade math class. Bragging is when you say, oh, you should see her. She just sits down and goes right through it before her time's even up. Oh, so impressive. You know, other kids are really struggling. Okay. That's bragging, right? Bragging is not merely saying, I've done this thing or I feel happy about this thing, but it's letting people know that you think that this is something that is special, right? That's when it becomes bragging, right? Saying I got a new car is not bragging. Saying I got a new car in a way lets everybody know that you're more special or your car is more special because of it, right? That's bragging. By the way, what note it is to have a new car. Okay, anything. Anyway, so there has been some research on bragging, and this is looking at a few different studies. So bragging is seen, by the way, as being more common among men. The research suggests it is more common among men. Also, there is a personality trait that is more associated with bragging, and that is narcissism, right? So being concerned with the self, right? Being narcissistic. So those who are more narcissistic do seem to brag more, and bragging is a bit more common among men. Now, as I said, I'm very interested in not so much what women do or what men do, but how do we respond to what women and men do? Well, how does that affect bragging? First off, bragging is seen as being a masculine trait. The research suggests that bragging is seen as something that's it's masculine, and so therefore it's not, if you'll forgive, it's not ladylike. What do I mean by that? What are the implications? Well, I'm so glad you asked me. So when men brag, so bragging can be seen as a way to demonstrate competence, but that largely is for men. When men brag, they then are seen as being more competent, or they're demonstrating their competence, and people read it that way. It's them just showing us their competence, and it's seen that way, and there's sort of a positive effect for them. Women who brag end up being seen as less likable and less hireable. In studies of bragging at job interviews, which is where a lot of this is done, the men get seen as being more competent, and the women have a tendency to be seen as less likable and perhaps even less hireable. I mean, she's bragging. It's just indelicate, right? But he does it. Well, he's bragging, but you know, so that's how you show your competence. That's how you really know your stuff and you're good and you should be hired. You're able to really promote yourself as a man, and a woman it's ugly. It's that sort of thing happening. So let's say a man doesn't brag and he pulls back and is a little more shy. He's modest in that way. There's a little bit of a backlash. It's seen that perhaps there's something wrong with him, that he's not very competent. So not merely that bragging makes him competent, but men who show modesty would seem to hurt their evaluation. Right? So men bragging, we see them as being more competent. When men are modest, it seems that they just don't get as positive ratings overall. Men are just not seen as positively when they become modest. Right? But women, when they brag, yeah, that makes them less likable, and even sort of maybe less hireable. One study said less likable necessarily did not affect hiring necessarily. The other one suggested it did affect hiring. So that's where we are with bragging.